Hey there, everybody. Welcome to the latest episode, this episode of Amy and TJ. I want to start by asking a question of you, Robach, of something you just said. Maybe other parents out there can possibly answer this. What does it mean when you say, I raised my child well enough? You just say you say you raised her right? You didn't say you raised her right. You were talking about something complimentary. You're complimenting your 17-year-old Annalise. Said I raised her right enough. What does that mean?
It means that I don't want to take credit for what she does well, and I also don't want to take credit for what she doesn't do well. No, I joke a little bit, but I do believe that what I wanted to do as a mom was to give them a foundation, give them an example, but then expect them to figure it out a little bit on their own. So when they start to figure it out, I'm proud, but I don't take credit because I know that there are...
That's crazy.
Really?
Take credit. Yeah, absolutely. I think you should take credit.
But
I've never heard that before. People say, yeah, oh, you were raised right. Somebody raised you right. Or sometimes your own parents will say, I raised you right, because they're proud of something that you just did. You did have to lay a foundation, but that foundation, again, it's foundation. So for them to build on. So when you said right enough, I was laughing, but now I didn't know. You didn't know I was going to ask you this question, but I didn't know you were going to get so heavy on me there.
Well, you know what? I think what I have tried to do is not take ownership of my children. They're not mine. They're their own beautiful, free souls who I get to guide. But at the end of the day, what they choose is what they choose. And so that's kind of where the disconnect was, where I kind of,
you sound like
I created a buffer.
Cover when they fuck up.
No, look, actually, you know, the funny thing is when they do fuck up, I probably will take ownership of that and say, what did I do wrong? And I'll probably feel guilty about it. And hilariously, I think I'd be more willing to take that on and say, I should have done better here, there, or wherever. But when they do well, I want them to own it. So anyway, it's silly. It was just a little thing. She thanked you for something without my prompting, which I was like, oh, that's so good to hear. I raised her well enough or right enough. Like, okay, good. Like I wasn't expecting that. And then it made me really happy that she did it, but I didn't want to take credit for it. Does that make any sense?
I don't know. If my child would have done something, I said, man, I feel good. Even though I said it to myself, man, I raised her right. She was raised right. Man, I did a good job. I did something right. I would never think, well, I did right enough.
I think I know that I've messed up enough, but I actually just took her to the airport. She's going on spring break. Again, here's another story of me having a child go off on their own. So she's at an age where I did this too my senior year, but this is for me, the first time she's going anywhere without any sort of supervision. So eventually, even when she gets there, she's still with her other friends. So we had some amazing conversations in the car on the way to the airport. And of course, it's a very long ride to JFK on a busy commuting Monday. Sorry, I can't talk. On a very busy commuter day, work week day. It's not Monday. Yes.
It is not Monday.
Wow. I'm doing great. So
you're doing just good enough.
I'm doing right enough. Yes. I hope everyone can commiserate if you two get tongue. No. Oh my God. Okay. Maybe I should let you keep talking. No. So anyway, we had a good conversation about just all the different twists and turns of life and how I'm just proud of how she's made certain choices. And I'm proud of the fact that her resilience has shown through some very difficult times. And so I was just talking to her about carrying that with her throughout her life and taking all of these moments when things don't go the way you want them to, or things get messy, that you find a way not to point to other people and say, why did you do this to me? Why did this happen to me? But instead to say, I learned something and I'm going to be able to take what I learned and make this something that I can own. I can say, what can I do better? What can I do differently? Anyway, we just had this great, insightful conversation.
Yeah, sounds
maybe
like
that prompted the thank you. I don't know.
Great way to start spring break. Wah, 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 as you would say. No. It's not,
That's fair. That's fair.
Your kids are really, really impressive. To be honest with you. They are really, really impressive. They're so different, but yes. I didn't plan on asking you about that when we started here, but that just came up. You said I raised her right enough, and that was funny to me. I planned on starting the episode by talking about something That was 7 episodes ago. 7 episodes ago. I don't expect you to remember exactly, but it was the episode that we had Dr. Elizabeth Coleman on.
Okay.
Now, do you remember, and again, this is not a trick question, but you might remember what I said to you when we started. There was a particular way. Do you remember what I said at the beginning of that episode?
The beginning of the Dr. Coleman episode? No. You're going to have to refresh my memory.
I came in hot.
You came in hot.
The first thing out of my mouth was, I got a bone to pick with you.
I still don't remember.
Okay. All right. That's okay. But Dr. Coleman was on because Dr. Coleman has a book talking about women's health. And she was in the studio with us at the time when we were starting. And I told you, I got a bone to pick with you because
I see where you're going.
It had been a year and a half since you had your recommended blood work as a breast cancer survivor for them to come back in and check you out. Okay. Am I setting this up right? You remember now?
Yes, I absolutely do. And so, yes, up until that point, it had been recommended to me and I had followed very religiously going in every 6 months for blood work.
And we want to keep, and again, so we want to start here, folks, with a little bit of news because we have had you all along for this journey. So move forward a few episodes after that one, and you gave an update that you had, in fact, made your appointment. Now, we won't get into why you made, I'm going to get into why you made the appointment. I was actually having some health issues, and I have some had some unexplained weight loss, and you were telling me to get into the doctor, and you were on me pretty good about it.
Yeah, I said maybe you needed some blood work.
Yes, you did, which was hilarious coming from a woman who's a year and a half past. But I wasn't trying to shame you, but you should have gotten in. There were reasons for, fine, whatever.
It worked.
But you told us on that episode that you had, in fact, made an appointment, yes?
Yes, and I surprised you with it. I didn't even realize that I was going to drop that bomb, but it was a good one. And so, yes, I did. And we went in together and I got the blood work. It actually was remarkably quick and easy. It's so funny what you worry about and what you think about. And then when it actually happens and you do it, it's so much easier than you were anticipating. Isn't it always the anticipation that's the toughest part? And so we went in, got the blood work. It was awesome to have you by my side. Thank you, because I always have a little bit of a tough time emotionally going back into that building where I first got diagnosed. And I think that is part of the reason why I drag my feet a little bit. Not only am I worried about potentially what the results could be, but it's just going back into that building is tough for me. So to have you there with me was huge. So thank you. And got the results back just a little while ago. And I am all clear. All clear. And I think when I sent you the text, I sent a little champagne glasses clinking, like cheers. Because thank you for pushing me a little bit to get into that office and to be able to say, okay, I got the blood work and now I have an all clear for a while. And now she told me I can come back once a year now. So I've graduated to once a year, but the threat is always there and I'll probably always drag my feet a little bit because it's always scary. What's this test going to show? What's this blood work going to do? But when you do it, and you do, if you are lucky enough to get a good result, wow, is that a huge, huge relief?
And I don't want to be crass or have this sound like I'm not being sensitive to it, but I have been learning. I've known you obviously for 10 years, but been in a relationship with you like this only for the past year and a half, 2 years, coming up on potentially here this year. But I am learning about what this means to and why you did drag your feet. Because when you go in, again, I'll put this in the shortest way. This is how you all explained it to me. Breast cancer survivor, you go in and get this blood work. If there is a recurrence or it has come back, it's essentially a death sentence. You're essentially being told that this cancer now is metastatic and there's no cure for that. So you go in and sitting in that office with Dr. Oratz, who you obviously know well, but I've had a chance to get to know here lately. Did I have more questions than you?
You did. You asked a lot of questions. Actually, well, it was such a loving thing to do because, yes, you're a journalist, but you're curious because you love me and you haven't been along in an intimate way on this journey. And so you had questions about being a breast cancer survivor and what that means. And most people don't know unless they've walked down that road. And especially, there are different kinds of breast cancers, but she pointed out to you when you have a estrogen positive cancer, some of the other cancers are more aggressive and scarier at first. And if you can make it 5 years or 10 years, there's a bigger relief of woohoo. It's probably not going to come back. When you have a estrogen positive cancer, I also had a positive lymph node. My ONCA score was higher than they expected. So there's a lot of things that factor into it. But she basically explained to you that I can never have that sigh of relief.
Ever in life. She explained percentages, and I'm like, how do they go up? How do you get them down? And I understand it a little better now. But even listening to you now, this is where I think a lot of people in society don't get unless you have somebody right next to it. But when you say a lymph node this or an ONCA score that, it gets into the weeds to where I don't get it. I'm learning a little more. But bottom line, when you go in and you get this blood work, you are essentially waiting for them to tell you whether or not you have gotten a death sentence. And that is the simplest and shortest way. And I didn't want you to see me, but I wiped tears out of my eyes sitting in that office. And you didn't see that.
I didn't see that.
How she's explaining things. Yeah. And I'm trying to be the strong one, to crack a joke here and do this and keep everything warm. And she said a few things that just fucks me up to think about the road ahead. And it makes you want to, we are not wasting a day. We just cannot. And yeah, you might never have to deal with breast cancer again the rest of your life. Hopefully that's the case. But I thought it was important to share with the audience. Yes, in fact, it is done. We got the all clear. Now we wait a year for the next one.
You know what I want to point out too, it is a death sentence right now, 100%.
But yes.
But there are new advances being made every year, and there is an incredibly advanced quality of life, but it is a completely different way of life. And you've seen it through our dear, beautiful friend Morgan, where you now have a life of treatment always. Every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, you are getting chemo infusions or you're getting some sort of immunotherapy, and your body is weakened and you have a different standard of life. And so it is a complete about face from the way a lot of us and most of us live. And so there is an intention behind every moment that you don't necessarily have until you've walked this path. And I hope no one has to, but there is a beauty in it. There is a joy in it. I'm about to go on a trip with Morgan here in a couple weeks because that girl is seeing the world. And, that's what I have taken from this, is that all of us aren't guaranteed tomorrow. So if all of us can live differently and better because of it. But a light bulb went off for you. I could tell. Yesterday.
Yeah, it did. And look, they will continue to do so, and I'll continue to learn. And look, being with you has been one of the great joys of my life. You never know which direction life is going to take you, but here we are. The universe has us here. And to your point there about you never know what day is going to be your last or what moment. And we certainly thought about that and talked about that when we were watching the bridge collapse in Baltimore. Just to think the people who were just going about their day or working or whatever, and something like that in a moment, a split second. And you kept pointing out as we were watching the video of the cars that were going by. I mean, think about the people who just missed it by seconds or a minute or whatever going across that bridge, and they got home to their families or whatever, because you just never know. You were in a moment where something like that happened. So we wanted to certainly acknowledge that's going to be a story for a long time, a lot of healing in that community and rebuilding in that community. And as we were talking here, I believe it's 6 people who are unaccounted for, and they've called off the search. But that was an awful thing to see.
Yeah, we woke up to it, and watching that video just makes your heart wrench and your stomach just tighten, because you just think, oh my goodness, probably those folks were either, I don't know, coming back from the airport or getting off of a long night shift, who's driving at those hours, and you're probably just wanting to get home, or maybe you're going to work, but not thinking about the unthinkable, right?
Thank God it was 1:30 in the morning.
Thank God it was 1:30 in the morning. But I was looking at those cars like just seconds before, thinking, what are those people thinking now? And you know what? I bet every one of those people who were on that bridge moments before, and there were a lot of them, will never live the same. They will never look at each day the way they did before. They will hug. When I start, honestly, this weekend, when I know I'm about to get a blood test, and it's silly to have it only be in these moments, but I'm reminded again, call your friends, call your family, tell them you love them. Like, you just don't know.
So yeah, and that other part of that, and you and I have been to scenes of our careers.
Yeah.
Many times we get that call, head to this town, head to that town. And it was so much of what we did for so long. And we got into the business because we did enjoy the reporting. We did enjoy being on the big stories. And watching this and thinking, being on those scenes and that emotion and the toll it takes on you over 10, 20, 30 years, nothing compared to what those families are going through. But it was to sit back and watch it from a distance. It kind of struck me a little differently to watch it this way, and didn't have a desire to want to rush out there and be on the scene and do the reporting, is how I felt in that moment, because it's just so draining and emotional, and just I had that thought when I was watching something.
Well, we didn't talk about that. I just said, oh God, you get transported to what we did, as you said, for all those years, and getting the calls in the middle of the night and jumping on planes and racing to these scenes of just awful tragedy, whether it was a school shooting, or it was an act of terrorism, or just a horrific natural disaster, or an unexplained accident. But yeah, we've rushed to those scenes for the majority of our adult lives and talked to the people most directly affected. But yes, when you're sitting back and watching it, and I will say, yes, our hearts go out to all of the people impacted and affected. And yet I don't miss putting myself in the middle of it all. Yeah. It's a lot. It's a lot. But it was, that was probably one of the first big news stories where there were casualties that we weren't called to report on.
But look, we applaud. There are plenty of journalists out there, reporters doing great work. And to be on that scene, it's not just a matter of the hours and getting in front of a camera and all of that, being away from your family. It takes a toll on those journalists we know to be there and talking to families or dealing with communities that are having such a difficult time. So our hearts go out to them. And this was a big story. We both think back to another big story that we covered years and years ago that we didn't think we'd be covering again because this was 20 plus years ago now. And what we're talking about here is the Lacey Peterson and Scott Peterson, his murder trial. He's been in prison for 20 plus years now, convicted of her murder. I don't have to go into the backstory about Lacey Peterson, Scott Peterson, you know it. But to sit here now with you, Robach, and to think that story's not over, to think that there is now someone legit, I say someone, an entity, the LA Innocence Project. The Innocence Project in this country has a hell of a reputation. They are getting involved to possibly look at new evidence that they say could possibly exonerate Scott Peterson.
That's right. And you and I have talked about this because when you cover these stories the way we have, yes, there is the trial. Yes, there's the jury and the conviction, and there's some interest in all of that. People love crime shows. But what we know is when you cover these stories, it's the victims' families that are obviously the most impacted, that get lost in so many ways when we're all covering this. And so as we talk about this, I do want to acknowledge, and I know you do too, TJ, Lacey Peterson's family. They have been through something that none of us would ever want for anyone we love, to lose their daughter and their grandson, Connor. She was 8 months pregnant, both of their bodies washed up 4 months after she went missing. I think that was April of 2003, and what they've been through. So finally to get through the trial, to feel like there's some justice, of course, their pain never ends, but to at least feel like they've had justice served.
They're 2 decades removed.
Yes.
They kind of, I don't want to say they ever would completely move on, but for 20 years, you think that the person responsible for killing these 2 people you love is gone away. And this is done. And you're trying to move on and rebuild in your life. And now can you imagine them being told, wait a second. This guy might be innocent. So what happened? Can you imagine what's going on in their heads?
No. And so all of this has obviously been happening for quite some time, because remember in 2020, he actually had, he was originally convicted to death. I mean, he was sentenced to death. He was on death row. And a few years ago, he was taken off death row. His sentence was commuted to a life sentence without parole. That's one thing. But now the LA Innocence Project is involved, as you pointed out. They have some new DNA evidence that they would like to be tested. They say they have other evidence that they say will set him free, that will exonerate him. Scott Peterson has maintained his innocence throughout this entire, from the beginning. He's always said he didn't do this, and they've always pointed the finger at these other potential suspects. There was a burglary across the street, and so now I do feel for Laci's family that they now have to go through this all again. And we haven't heard from them, by the way. But we did want to talk to Scott Peterson's attorney, Mark Geragos. He represented him from the beginning. I'm sure many of you know his name. He is a very famous defense attorney. And he has always said that this case for him was his greatest, not just professional defeat, but personal defeat, because he has always believed in Scott's innocence. And so as this case now comes back into the limelight, just a few weeks ago, we saw Scott Peterson in court via Zoom, and now he will have another court date in just a few weeks. So this is just the beginning, and this is going to be going on for several months into the summer, and we'll see what happens if he gets a new trial. Of course, that's what he wants. But we were able to sit down with Mark Geragos just a few days ago to talk about the trial that happened, what his feelings are, and what he thinks may happen next. Bring a little. Mark, tell us what is going on with the Scott Peterson case. I know you and I talked about this a decade ago, and you've always said Scott Peterson is innocent. You didn't say he was not guilty. You said he was innocent.
Yeah, and I've taken a lot of heat for it, and I get it. I mean, he's not the first or probably last most hated man in America that I'll represent in my career, but I have said for almost 20 years, I don't think anybody knew the evidence in real time better than I did. And I saw nothing over the course of that year to 15 months that we were kind of intensely immersed in it that led me to believe that he did it. In fact, everything that I saw, all the evidence I saw, I was always fairly confident, no matter who they put up there, no matter what document they had, no matter what document dump they did, that it was always going to exonerate him. And it certainly did in terms of what I saw. I mean, part of the problem with that case was that where the body was recovered was the thing that people could not get past. And what I always point out in response to that is, look, between the time Laci went missing with Connor and the time she was found was over 4 months. Where she was found was widely known within a week. So you had a 4-month period of time where everybody knew where his alibi was, number one. Number two, that may have been the most searched area in America. They brought in the U.S. Navy. They brought in sonar. They brought in submarines. They brought in, by the way, that bay used to recede to a height of about 6 to 12 inches. Nobody found a thing for 4 months until a large storm came along, and then all of a sudden the remains washed ashore.
Mark, are you more certain now since the trial? Have you seen things that make you even more sure of his innocence?
Yeah, he's and you know, I like to say at my recommendation, Cliff Gardner, who handled his appeal and the initial stages of his habeas, who successfully argued to the California Supreme Court to unanimously reverse the death penalty conviction. He did a wonderful job post-conviction of investigating some of the things that were turning up after the conviction. Every single thing that's turned up after the conviction has pointed to the fact that he should have been exonerated of this thing. Not the least of which is the day that he was convicted, the prosecution handed me, mind you, the jury was out for 9 days. They removed, several jurors who were voting not guilty because the judge had told me, confidentially, and he's now passed away, that the then California Supreme Court Chief Justice had told him there's no way this thing is going to be a hung jury. You cannot let this be a hung jury. And so while the jurors were deliberating over the course of that week and a half, they were removing the jurors who were not voting guilty, basically. And when they finally got the verdict, the prosecution that day handed me a call sheet. And it turns out there was a lieutenant at the Chino State Prison who had overheard a call of an inmate talking to one of the burglars about confronting Lacey. And so if you're not in the weeds on this case, there was a burglary across the street. At the time, back in that we tried this case, Modesto PD took the position that burglary had occurred on the 26th of December. Well, if you believe that, you would believe that the throng of media that was already out there on that street, on a very narrow street, and camped out with satellite trucks, that there was a burglary happening 30 feet away, and they never saw it or saw anything about it. So part of the Innocence Project now is a van that had been burned out with a mattress, and that we think may relate to the burglary.
So right now, from what I understand, the LA Innocence Project is asking that some blood that was found on that mattress be tested. I believe it's already been confirmed that it's human, but what are they looking for, and what do you think they may find?
Well, this is an interesting, another little twist here. So 20 years ago, during the case, mitochondrial DNA, mind you, this is going back to 2004, was not admissible in California. We actually had a 1-week hearing to get mitochondrial DNA admitted. So you think about that, it's kind of crazy because now we assume DNA is always admissible, blah, blah, blah. Hopefully, there is enough remnants. Hopefully, there is still a sample that the California Department of Justice still has that they can then test the DNA. Mind you, they do have or did have samples. One of the ways that they confirmed that it was Lacey and Connor at the time was they had samples of DNA, and when their remains washed up, they were able to use the DNA samples that the Department of Justice had in order to confirm it was them. I would hope that there still is a sample maintained. It hasn't degraded, and that they can figure out whether or not there is a connection here.
Is everything, in your opinion, riding on that blood sample, that DNA sample? And what if it turns out it's not connected to Lacey Peterson? Then what?
No, I think, look, would it be fortuitous if it was? Absolutely. Is everything riding on it? No. I mean, if you were to look at the habeas corpus that has been filed in this case, the California Supreme Court, when they issued the order reversing the death penalty, they said the judge used the wrong standard and we were complaining about it in real time. Anybody who said, I don't support the death penalty, the judge would dismiss them. What you ended up getting as a jury were people who were pro-death penalty. If you've been around the courts, you know, or if you have anecdotal experience, you know pro-death penalty tilts pro-law and order, tilts pro-prosecution. So there was a whole demographic that we lost of people who they didn't ask the next question. If you're anti-death penalty, can you set that aside and follow the law? The judge didn't do that, so they reversed that. I always took the position, if you reverse the penalty phase, then you should have reversed the guilt phase verdict. There's that in the habeas, which has not gone to the federal, been decided federally. There's also a series of other errors that were committed that has not been decided federally. This is just one of probably 100 different issues that has now percolated up to the point where somebody has said, by the way, this was all sparked by Scott himself filing a writ of habeas corpus. Innocence Project got involved once the Court of Appeal said, hey, yeah, there is something here. And that's why this judge, within the last 2 weeks, has basically told the prosecution, you have to answer, and you have to answer this in the next 30 days.
Yeah, I think his next hearing is April 16th. How often do you talk to Scott, if at all? I know you were close, obviously. When this trial was going on, you've believed in him all of these years. Do you speak to him?
I haven't spoken to him recently. He does write to me. He writes letters, which is better than I do. I've been ruined by email. But the letters are informative and heartfelt, and I appreciate them. And I speak more often with his sister-in-law, and she's doing a wonderful job kind of being the engine for driving the fact and the getting the exoneration for him.
Getting to this point, knowing that, again, believing as strongly as you do that he is innocent, so he's been sitting in prison wrongfully for decades now. Now this has come up. What does this stir up in you? Even, I know you're a professional and everybody knows you're hard-nosed and damn good at your job. But how does it stir you up knowing that a guy that you represented and worked with has been sitting somewhere that you don't think he should have been for the past 20 years?
Hey, look, I said it was one of the worst professional setbacks I've ever had. I'm jokingly, not so jokingly engaged. It's required a lot of alcohol therapy in the interim, but I have this kind of maybe childlike naivete that eventually he will be exonerated and eventually they'll figure out what really happened, because as I've said, and I will continue to say, anybody who spent as much time with the evidence and spent as much time with Scott as I have, I'm just convinced he didn't do it. I will tell you, I probably as a private practitioner have represented more people accused of murder than anybody walking around for whatever reason. I've handled over 40 years countless murder cases. I know when somebody is good for it. And having said that, anticipate a question. Just because you did the deed does not mean the inquiry ends there. Is it a first? Is it a second? Is it a murder? Is it a manslaughter? I have another case right now, the Menendez brothers, which were on habeas, and it's my position there. They did it, but they did not deserve to be convicted of murder. It should have been a manslaughter. I'm not naive enough to not understand who can do this, who has the capability to do this. Scott does not, in my experience, based on what I've seen and based on the evidence, this is not somebody who could have committed this horrendous act.
Mark, you said the evidence wasn't there, that no one knows it better than you. Obviously, you know what the prosecution laid out. There was a lot of circumstantial evidence. There was the Amber Fry, where he was having an affair a few months prior. Lacey was 8 months pregnant. He told Amber that he was a widower. But if you believe so strongly that the evidence doesn't support the conviction, why do you think those jurors voted to convict?
Oh, I think it's clear that when Pat Harris, who I tried the case with, and Pat has done a yeoman's job over the years continuing to represent him, Pat, after he listened to the Amber Fry tapes, said it's a tough thing to get over. I was not as convinced that it was that tough, but you have to understand, Scott intuitively knew, and I will tell you why I wasn't as affected. I had represented Gary Condit, who was, for those who don't remember, was a congressman in California before the 9/11, was kind of the scandal du jour that was covered by the what I call the axis of evil. Back then, for a criminal defendant, that was cable news at night, the morning shows, and People magazine. So that was the axis of evil. And Gary Condit and Chandra Levy and her disappearance was the scandal du jour. I remember at the time thinking, just because somebody is accused of having an affair, I understand that you can just get blinded to that. Mind you, in that case, I kept saying at the time, there's another guy who's sitting in prison, in Gary Condit's case, who was jumping women in the park where next to where Chandra used to run. I said, to me, it's obvious that's the logical suspect. Nobody wanted to hear that because they were convinced, a la Dominic Dunn, that it had to be the guy who was having the affair. That is, I get it, that's human nature. I saw the same thing happening here. Frankly, the idea that Scott Peterson, because he's having an affair with Amber Fry, and I don't want to denigrate her, but, this was not Helen of Troy, that he was going to murder his unborn son and his wife because he had fallen for this massage therapist out of Fresno. I mean, I realize it's probably not politically correct, but just because your wife is pregnant in her 8th month and you're bing bang bonging with some woman, who admitted on the stand he never said I love you or anything else. To me, that is ludicrous. It makes absolutely no sense that a guy, mind you, we put a nun on in the mitigation penalty phase, a nun who had known Scott virtually her whole life as a character witness. The idea that kid, Scott Peterson, all of a sudden, because of Amber Fry, decided to off his wife and his unborn son was as ludicrous to me as anything you could ever imagine. So it's a long way of saying I don't buy it. I think the jury had this problem. When we selected that jury, I'll never forget, there was a radio station had hired a truck to encircle the courthouse. We had shifted. I'd won the change of venue, but be careful what you wish for. We got sent from Modesto or Stanislaus County to San Mateo, which was not exactly an upgrade. I was bitterly fighting for Orange County because I said if there's ever a constituency for Scott, it would be adulterous golfers. And where are you going to find those but Orange County, California? So, but I couldn't get Orange County. To the point, Amy, where I kept saying, the DA, who's now a judge, Rick DeStasso, I said, your parents live in Orange County. Let's go to Orange County. But we get San Mateo. But the truck that's running around the courthouse as 1,600 jurors are coming in has got Scott in his orange jumpsuit, man or monster, for people to vote during jury selection. And Monster won like 97% to 3%. There was just no way he was going to get acquitted in that carnival-like atmosphere. Take a look, Google the pictures of the celebration around the courthouse when he was convicted. It was like nothing anybody has ever seen. There's a picture on the front page of the local paper, a woman holding her child saying, this is better than the day my son was born. So you have to understand what it was like. That was why I was attracted to the case in the first place, because I don't like bullies. I don't like when you're swept up in this maelstrom. But at the same time, that's what we were up against.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff you describe as procedural and mistakes made, and why he shouldn't have been convicted. Can you point to something? Maybe we have seen it, maybe we haven't, maybe this will be a part of this proceeding now, like one piece of evidence that you think exonerates him?
A couple of things that I think were just ridiculous that I'll never get over. One was, we had done a demonstration. I'd gone out and I bought the same boat. I put one of the kids, he's not a kid anymore, he's been a lawyer for 17 years now, but back then he was an aspiring lawyer. I put him in the boat with a dummy, same weight as Lacey. I tried to have him, and we filmed it, throw the dummy overboard without capsizing the boat because it made zero sense. And he tried it 3 times and he almost drowned, frankly. It just could not do it. The judge would not allow that in. However, during deliberations, they asked to see the boat. And what's the first thing they did when they asked to see the boat? The jurors and I and the judge and the prosecutors all went into the parking lot where they had pulled the boat in. And the jurors got in the boat and started rocking the boat, because that was one of the first things they wanted to say is, how could you have done what you said you did? The prosecution theory was the night before, She had gone missing. He had killed her, put her in the boat, had made anchors, and then thrown her overboard. It couldn't happen. And the jurors were struggling with that. And sure enough, got in the boat, started rocking around. I went crazy with the judge saying, this is an experiment. How can you allow this? And that's one. That's to give you. There was another where they let in dog scent evidence. This may be the greatest definition of junk science I've ever seen. They had one dog that I somehow got a hold of the training videos for this dog. This dog was going in every different direction during the training videos. It was a complete disaster. Yet somehow the dog handler was allowed to testify as to what the dog was thinking. So that's the kind of quality of evidence that we had here. And it was just anything goes to get a conviction because he was, as I may have mentioned, the most hated man in America.
And I know you're out of time almost, but why did he run, and how much did that hurt him?
That's another, and Amy, I will repeat this, another one of my favorite stories. People will often say, why did he do this? Why did he do that? And I will say, let me give you an example. Every morning I would go to the gym and there would be and it was always white professional women. So you fit the profile. So white professional women would always say, well, why did he run? And I would say, he didn't run unless you think he was running to Canada because he was arrested going north on the 5 freeway. So they'd say, well, he dyed his hair. And I'd say, well, he did that because he was still working as a fertilizer salesperson, and the media kept following him to every appointment, and it was extremely difficult for him to make a sale to support himself with a throng of media. And they'd say, well, he had cash. And I said, yes. His brother would give him cash because he didn't want to go to ATM machines. Okay. Then they'd say, well, what about the fact that he had told the Lacey's stepfather he'd gone fishing? I said, well, did you know that up until the trial, when I asked the late Ron Gransky, where were you on Christmas Eve, Mr. Gransky? And he said, I was fishing. And so then inevitably the white professional woman would say, well, I don't care about the evidence. I used to have a boyfriend just like him, and I could see him doing the exact same thing. Well, how do you get past that?
Yeah, I hear you. You know, this is going to be so fascinating to see what happens over the next few months. And I know you'll be on top of it all. And Mark, I hope you will come back and talk about this with us because you have perspective like no one else. So we thank you so much for your time and for all of those details that most people will never get to hear unless they heard them right here.
Okay. When I come back, Amy, we can do on your podcast a description of the last time you and I went bar hopping like that dog that was hitting more spots than Amy Rohrback on a Saturday night.
Let's do that first, and then we'll do the podcast. It'll be a hoot.
Okay.